Welcome to an encore episode of the Remarkable Retail Podcast as Steve and I take a break at Recharge for Season 6, launching January 17th, 2023, presented by Marketile. We've removed the current retail events news and have gotten right to the episode's heart.
That's right. We thought during our hiatus we would bring back some of our most popular episodes from our back catalog, which is now getting pretty extensive. And we also are lucky to have lots of new listeners and subscribers, so perhaps they have not heard these before. The last encore episode that we piloted was top rated. And yes, as you know, we are all about testing new things here on the Remarkable Retail Podcast.
We start with this one goes to 11 from 2020. Why'd you choose this episode, Steve?
Well, with 8 essentials of remarkable retail, we had a few to choose from. I guess I wanted to pick this one because it is about number 7, being memorable, which I think is the essential that gets most at the heart of what it means to be remarkable. So I thought it would be good to go back and maybe refresh some people's memories for people that are familiar with the framework. But if not, they'll get to hear a little bit more about it. And one of the most interesting and impactful ones, I think.
Well, all right. Let's listen in now. I wanted to start out talking about this memorable concept with this great quote. You start many, if not all the chapters off with a quote, but I thought this one resonated with me particularly. So share it with us and share it with the listeners.
Sure. So the quote is from Gary Friedman, who is and has been the CEO of Restoration Hardware, or RH, as they now like to be known. And it says, or he says, great brands don't chase customers. Customers chase great brands. I really like it because I think it really underscores the difference between brands that are truly remarkable and memorable and those that maybe are just okay. As managers of retail companies, we basically have to be running around, throwing promotions, whatever, at our customers to get them to buy from us, as opposed to customers being automatically just kind of intensely interested in us and maybe not needing much of a discount at all.
On the Canadian side of the border, the Bay, which is now Hudson's Bay, Saks and whatever, used to have their slogan for years was it's hard not to think of the Bay. And it's funny because it was kind of trying to capture that same essence, right? Is that the whatever it was, this zen of being memorable. And memorable, I don't think is just this tactical, I remember a particular experience, but it all rolls up somehow. So why don't you take us through how you see memorable in the context really of the framework? Because memorable has a pretty pivotal role, and you give lots of examples that we're going to go through on the episode.
Certainly memorable can mean a bunch of different things, right? Things could be memorable because they're really bad. Of course, I'm talking about not only experiences or brand impact that's really good, but something that's more than just a fleeting moment. So it's really here, I guess, at the level of business design and brand positioning, we're talking about memorable, not just that, you had a great sales experience one time or a really good meal or something like that. So that's the distinction I try to make. And to your point about the Bay, I think there's this idea I talk about a little bit of kind of owning the real estate of the mind, where we've got that top of mind awareness, or maybe when we start to talk about a particular retailer, or it could be a restaurant, it could be whatever, a hotel, we just kind of instantly bring up this vision in the customer's mind of what a great experience it is and how close you feel to that brand. So there aren't that many brands that really occupy that kind of position, but it's certainly what we're trying to aim for when we try to become remarkable.
It's almost like being memorable in the future. In other words, if you say a brand like RH, I have an expectation of what it's going to be like, even in a brand new store, even in a brand new concept that's even associated with like an RH or whoever, that you feel, as you said, you've got this space in your mind. I mean, we all play those fun games with brands, right? When I say Volvo, you say,
right.
But, this idea that you're occupying with a memorable experience, but the more important, it's the brand that's memorable, right? And
sure.
And, that's really what you're trying to get to, right?
Yeah. I mean, some of this is certainly very much part of what great branding executives and marketing and advertising folks have been trying to do for for a long period of time is really create that elevated, memorable, remarkable, whatever you want to call it, brand position. And certainly that can manifest in a lot of different ways, depending upon the product category. And like you say, in some cases, there are brands we may not think about very often because we're not in the market for a car constantly, right? Whereas, I don't know, if you're selling apparel or something, it's much more frequently purchased, and you'd want to have that top of mind awareness kind of day in, day out, or at least week to week, month to month. So I think brand, at the highest level really occupies not only the real estate of the mind, but this really kind of strong emotional connection as well. In many cases, a very visual connection. One of the things that I mention in my book, but I've been doing in some of my keynotes for a long time, I'll show a picture of what looks to be just kind of the run of the mill department store. And I'll say to the audience, okay, what store is this? What brand is this? Right. And depending upon what country I'm in, I'll hear basically the name of the moderate department store that they have in town. So in the US, Kohl's, Macy's, JCPenney, that sort of thing. Then I say, well, actually, I have no idea what store this is.
I love that story.
Because I just Googled generic department store interior, and this was the best photo that came up, so I put it in my PowerPoint. Then I click to the next slide, and it's the interior of an Apple store. I don't say that, and I ask, well, what store is this? And like instantly, everybody in the audience says Apple. I'm not trying to make it about visual design, but I think clearly there are all these aspects of brands that we absorb, and some of them just basically don't stand out very much, or it's hard to tell one from the other, whether it's their store environment or it's actually looking for product or going to their website or whatever it might be. And then others just really occupy this special, very memorable place.
As you think about the difference between being distinctive and being memorable, and in other words, there's some layouts that are very distinctive and you can pick it out of from a screen on a stage. Others just, it leaves you with something greater than the sum of its parts, right? And that's what I think about, the collectivity of experience. Talk about that. And in your mind, what does great experience mean, and how does it roll up to be memorable? And when I say in your experience, I'm talking about that very strategic level versus the tactical Instagrammable stores, or something that they've done to make it particularly notable. Like you remember Whole Foods. Mm-hmm. I remember Whole Foods, and they did this thing where they stacked the produce up vertically, and it was in all the trade magazines. It was, oh my God, look how and it visually was very striking, right? Sure. It was very different. But that's not the brand. The brand isn't Whole Foods. We're the store that stacks stuff up vertically. It was nested in something bigger. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are a couple things here. One is, there's a little bit of this semantics exercise, I guess we could go through about what does it mean to be experiential?
Right.
People have been talking about, retail's moving to experiences and
return on experience.
Return on experience. There's a lot of folks that have, myself included, that have talked about this. I think it's a little bit vague what we mean when we talk about experience, because at one level, I think all of retail, even if it's pretty boring, is still experiential. If you go into a physical store or you're on your mobile device or whatever, you've got sight, touch, you're having some sort of experience. I think what people are trying to get at is that it's something really elevated beyond just kind of the run-of-the-mill transactional nature of a lot of retail. But to your point, I think the second thing is, there are experiences that are kind of parts or ingredients of the whole brand that may be very well worth doing. Interesting visuals. A lot of folks have been putting in coffee bars or a ping pong table or some, interesting visual element.
Or a bar, or like in the Nordstrom's in Manhattan, right? There's a bar in the shoe level. It's
sure. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, in a lot of cases, that can be super helpful. But that in and of itself doesn't necessarily make for a really memorable brand. So I think we're looking for a collection of things that are, and I think we can talk in a second maybe about what I think the components of a memorable brand strategy are. But I think we do have to make a little bit of the difference between just kind of a one-off experience or a piece of the brand. And really what I'm trying to talk about here is really the whole of the brand positioning and the whole of the growth strategy.
Really to surface that, talk about, you could talk about pure play e-commerce players can have a memorable experience. And of course, we often talk about physical stores just because of our pedigree as physical stores, and they're so important in retail and so much change. But I think of this memorable experience of a product arrived on time, a product was packed well, it was easy to return. Like there's a whole gamut of things that can roll up to being actually memorable.
MarketDial's easy-to-use testing platform emboldens great decisions, leading to reliable, scalable results. With MarketDial, you can be confident in the outcome of your in-store pilot initiatives before rolling them out across your fleet. In a challenging retail climate of supply chain disruption, labor shortages, and dynamic customer behavior, the need for reliable insights has never been greater. Validate your remarkable ideas with MarketDial's in-store testing solution. The proof is in the testing. Learn more at MarketDial.com. That's MarketDial.com.
I want to pivot a little bit into, this idea that you can take a fairly vanilla environment and make it special just by dressing it up a little bit, just by kind of adding some things. We've seen recent examples of companies trying to do that, whether it was Macy's and they're trying to pick up the story theme or layouts, or whether it was JCPenney who went all the way around. Let's get away from discounts and do something else. What do you think about that? I mean, and how do companies start to go down this memorable path, and what steps can they take, and what steps should they avoid?
Well, we've talked about this a bunch of times, so at the risk of being a little bit repetitive, one of the main points I try to make through the whole book, and certainly in my consulting practice and speaking, is this idea that even very good is not good enough anymore.
Right.
That you have to be remarkable, and really that elevates the bar for performance on a whole bunch of dimensions. Just like we might have some interesting visual elements, there are things we can do in our operations or customer service or product, what have you, that can be very solid, very good, but they're not necessarily customer relevant enough or differentiating enough or enough of a departure to really earn that customer's business on a repeatable basis. One of the things I talk about elsewhere is, particularly if you think about the Macy's of the world, the JCPenney's, a lot of these department stores or retailers that are maybe not really doing so well and have struggled to differentiate themselves in recent years, is for them to really mount a reinvention, they have to, unless you have some belief that category spending is going to go dramatically up, the only way their profit model ever works again is for them to steal share from other competitors. And so it's not necessarily good enough to go from being a 5 to a 7 if your competition is at a 9 and 10, So
they got to go to 11, right. They need to go to 11. They got to go to 11, right? Because they got to get people back, and they actually have to break through an experience that is memorable for a different reason, and they got to overachieve, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think it has to be. I mean, certainly there are opportunities to use price discounts to incent trial and so forth. But if all you really have is bribery, at a certain point, you can't consistently be the low price guy if you don't have a low cost position. And certainly, relatively speaking, a lot of these modern department stores don't have low cost positions relative to the Walmarts and the Amazons and so forth. So the idea really is that it's one thing to be better, and I certainly think that there are a number of the players, whether we're talking about Penny's or Macy's or Hudson Bay or whatever, that have done better things in recent years. But I would argue that they are still not anywhere close to really being memorable, much less truly remarkable in their overall business strategy. So I don't think there's a one size fits all, but what you have to pay attention to is really what is it going to take to steal share and build loyalty over time with the customers you need to win with. A lot of the things that count for innovation at some of these companies really don't move the bar.
Well, you have often said a better version of okay, or I think you phrased it
slightly, yeah. The strategy I talk about is often a slightly better version of mediocre. And so if you've been mediocre for a while, as we can think of many brands that have been, a lot of these things are fairly incremental improvements. And I think in order to really understand where you need to get to, I think you have to be really honest about what it's going to take to win those customers that you have to win. Or if you're trying to get some of your existing customers to dramatically spend the amount of money they're spending with you, get more share of wallet, what is that really going to take? And most of the time, it's not just a little bit better visual merchandising and putting in a coffee bar.
It harkens back to the quote. In other words, when I think of the original iteration, not so long ago, of Restoration Hardware, now, as you say, RH, it was a vastly different vastly different retailer from a layout and an experience perspective, right? They completely re-engineered, they didn't tweak it. Let's just put it that way, right? They did, by all means, they didn't tweak. They really reinvented what they did, and to be remarkable as I think you would agree.
Yeah, it's one of the bolder, sometimes I talk about people doing timid transformations, which is a bit of an oxymoron. I think in the case of our age, it's pretty radical. And one of the things I've said is, and I don't know why I tell this story really, because it doesn't make you look great, but I heard Gary Friedman talk about his vision for these RH galleries at a conference, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, before they had made some improvements and been shifting the merchandise mix much more towards some of the products they have right now. But they were not anywhere close to these galleries, these new stores, if hopefully many
70,000, 80,000, 90,000 square foot.
And he did this presentation talking about what they were going to do. I honestly thought it was crazy. I'm like, wow, this is really, it's cool, but this is such a leap. And
I was going to say there was two schools of thought about it, to be polite. There was one school of thought about it, like, what are you doing? Like, that's not going to work at all. That's crazy. But man,
Well, I was wrong. And part of it probably was just, I wasn't, as much as I've been pushing innovation and working on innovation for many years, I think the fact of the matter is very few retailers take such a big leap in one fell swoop, right? So they they kind of tested elements of it, but I think it was one of these things that if you were going to build this temple to home furnishings, basically, there wasn't really a middle ground. You just had to go really take that leap. And certainly it's evolved for them as they've opened more stores. But it's really dramatic and very successful.
Absolutely. Let's unpack, again, one of the things I like about the book is not only do you talk about these things at a high level, but you actually have principles that the reader and now the listener can anchor themselves in. So talk about the 6 characteristics of memorable. Memorable is one of those $1 million terms, but you kind of bring it down to these 6 characteristics. Talk about those for a bit.
Yeah, so I tried to, as we talked about earlier, really the point of memorable is really to think about it more at the business design, brand positioning level. So that's kind of the first caveat going into this. But as you think about what makes a strategy memorable, what makes experiences memorable, the 6 that I talk about, the first is to really be unique, very different, distinctive, lots of different words you could put against that. The second one is to be intensely customer relevant. So you can certainly think about things that are unique that you could do that the customer doesn't care about. So these two certainly have to work hand in hand. The third, and I kind of hate this word, so maybe I should change it at some point, but it's authentic. And really what I mean by authentic is because, people say, oh, you should try to be more authentic. Well, if you have to try to be authentic, you're not being authentic, right? But
another oxymoron.
It's really, I think, another way of saying it for the advertising and marketing types is to really be on brand. Just bolting on things that might work for one of these cool fashion brands or a digitally native brand into your store that doesn't really fit with your overall brand positioning can just really be out of whack. So it has to really fit with your overall brand positioning or move you to where you're trying to go. The next one, which is frankly probably ultimately the most important one, is is it really wow worthy? Does it really evoke almost like a sense of awe or something you really want to talk about? Now, some of that is, do you want to share it on Instagram or tell your friends about it? I think, as you were alluding to earlier, it's not just about something that works on Instagram, but it has to be distinctive enough that it kind of creates its own momentum in terms of word of mouth or sharing on social media. The fifth is ownable. And what I mean by that is, can you really make it proprietary to your brand? So you might have a really cool coffee shop, but, is that really going to stand out for you as an apparel store? How does it really be something that you can kind of own that people will associate with your brand in a powerful way? And the last one, and this can play out a little bit differently, I think, whether we're talking about national retailers or global retailers versus smaller ones. But I think there has to be some element of it's got an enduring quality. There's some sustainability to it. So it's not just something it's there for the season, like an event. It would really be a series of events that build on each other. Now, I think if it's something that you are trying to, if you are a bigger chain and you're trying to really have this make a real dent in your overall brand positioning, then you have to think about, well, is it scalable? If we can only pull this off in one store, but the economics of it don't work, or we can't have the quality work time and time again on our whole chain, let's say, then, maybe more like a special event as opposed to something that's really intrinsic to your brand.
I love the 6-part characteristic because I kind of intuitively would use something very similar to that. In fact, I used your kind of notions of that in the most recent tour I did in Manhattan in January in the NRF. I usually take 30 or 40 retail CEOs from Canada on a tour, and I come down in advance and try to find remarkable, interesting stores. And where you're going to go, of course, you're in Manhattan for the NRF show. And I've been to stores like, Sonos and Shinola, as the bus driver called it. The Dreamery, you mentioned that in the book, Camp and the new Nordstrom store. What are examples that you can think of, and you talk about a few in the book, that stand out for you in terms of being memorable against these criteria? We've already talked about Restoration Hardware. So what other ones stand out in your mind?
Well, one of the things I do in the book, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but part of the reason I think why we're calling this episode, this one goes to 11, there's kind of two things going on there. There's the subtle reference, which hopefully some of the readers get to, about taking things to the next level. But I actually lay out ways to be memorable, different strategies that retailers employ to bring this memorable essential to life. And I happen to list 11 of them, but because I think they have different qualities and because retail is such a big industry, trying to get some different flavors. But let me just mention a few. So we talked about Restoration Hardware. I'll just mention that one again quickly because it's part of what I call a go big or go home strategy, which is, as much as there's been this narrative that there need to be fewer stores and the stores that we have should be smaller because of e-commerce, you do have some retailers going in a very different direction, Restoration Gallery being one, but we've also got Nebraska Furniture Mart, a bunch of retailers that have really said, look, we're going to create this kind of temple of consumption, I guess.
In Toronto, they had 4 or 5 Restoration Hardwares. Now they have one, but it is the epitome of being memorable. I think that's what you're talking about.
Right. And that's also an example, going back to Gary's quote of, so customers are chasing you. Like, that's the store I got to go see. If I'm buying this type of furniture, if I'm the target customer for this, I absolutely have to make sure I go there, as opposed to I'm only going to go there if they give me 30% off or whatever. The flip side of the strategy of go big or go home is what I call Honey, I Shrunk the Store, which are these more micro concepts. Now, the distinction I make, I'm not talking about kind of a skinny down version of, say, a Target store to work in an urban area where they've basically taken stuff out to get the economics to work. I'm talking about really concepts that have been built from the ground up as smaller concepts with more specific purposes. And the one I love the best is, at least so far, is Nordstrom Local, where, as I'm sure some of our listeners know, they've created it's a couple thousand square foot store. There's no merchandise in there to buy. It's mostly a personal service store, and it's actually turned out to be kind of an omni-channel or harmonized retail hub where they're taking, customers can pick up online orders, can return orders. And what I think is so fabulous about this is it's designed for a fairly narrow purpose, and it really extends the reach of the retailer and deals with some convenience issues that Nordstrom suffers from, frankly, of having relatively few stores in very congested areas. Another one, and there's kind of two flavors of this, I call the new customer intimacy. One of the things I think has been going on for a while, and it's really driven by a lot of the characteristics of internet shopping, which creates this long tail where you can have almost anything you want from anywhere in the world. That's driven, among other things, a fragmentation in the market where fairly small segments of customers can get what they want, whereas before, if you couldn't get distribution in a department store, maybe your product never gets beyond a certain point. Right. So some of these might be micro segments serving a very specific type of customer. For example, there's this brand called Fluid out of New York, which is focused on the LGBTQ community. And so not only do they have products which are more unisex or, or for non-binary people, but also they build a lot of community and content around it. But we see the same thing sometimes with, special sizes or people that have a really specific athletic interest or whatever. So there's a lot of ways where you can kind of cut the market down and build a concept really to go deep on a very small part of the market. The other kind of related one is to do something really special and elevated, but Scott Galloway refers to sometimes as special, not big. There are lots of examples of these. The few that I often talk about are some of these kind of over-the-top foodie places like I'm down here in Texas. Down the road in Austin is this place called Franklin Barbecue, which supposedly is the best barbecue in the world. People line up for 3 hours to get it. But you can see this.
And as an indication of that, I'm a bit of a barbecue fanatic, and I actually, I follow Aaron, who owns it, and on social media, and I actually make his sauce. He's got an espresso sauce.
But I think that's one of the things that's really interesting now too, is that some of these places, by virtue of how connected we are, and we talked about in the last episode, they can build a following online, right? And maybe people are just interested in what they're doing. They never actually have their food. Maybe it's like, oh, if I ever find myself in Austin, I'm absolutely going to go there, et cetera. And it's super interesting. So I think, 99% of the world may not get it or go like, it's nuts to stand in 3 hours in line to get this, or talk about Blue Star Donuts in Portland. There's a bunch of examples of this. Pay $4 for a donut I could get for 60 cents at the local donut place, right? Yeah. So it's very, very clearly not for everybody, but it is for some people that really are into whatever it is you're selling. So I think there's a lot of different ways to cut this, but it's very much going after more the minimally viable audience as opposed to I'm going to build this thing to a multi-billion-dollar business.
And I guess on the other end of the scale, as we've talked about, and I'm going to earn you a nickel or 50 cents here by saying bifurcated, but this kind of experience versus efficiency, and on the side of efficiency, the experience of ordering, whether it's Amazon Go, or Hema and Free Shippo in China, it is just relentlessly frictionless, and it's really a different type of experience, but still on the same idea. It's very memorable, right? Going to Amazon Go is a very memorable experience, but it's memorable in a different way. It's not RH memorable,
right?
But it's experientially different. And I want to end kind of last thoughts on that with, okay, so what does memorable now mean? I don't know if you've given any thought to this in the COVID era, where, we've got stores and retailers who do a little bit of, sometimes I think, hygiene theater. They have someone walking around squirting stuff. But is that, making it safe, is that more just a benchmark? Table stakes, as we would say, or what is memorable now in the COVID era?
I've been thinking about that. I'm not terribly sure a lot has changed. I do think, certainly safety and hygiene has been elevated in terms of things we worry about now. And presumably, even when we get beyond the pandemic, we'll for sure still worry about in a different way. I guess I generally think it's created a new set of baseline expectations that it's probably hard for anybody. Like I certainly think there are examples and things that were reported in the press about retailers that were particularly innovative, were first movers in terms of really demonstrating great sanitation practices and appointment-based shopping and a lot of other things that really, really were responsive to
great curbside, whatever. Yeah.
But I think, one of the things I make the point throughout the book is you have to really think about those things that really convey long-term competitive advantage. And there are lots of things that may give you an edge for a period of time. And that doesn't, you may very well want to do them. But if they're too easy to copy, or if it does become the new expectation, then that's not really earning you more than maybe a few weeks or a few months lead. So do it, but don't think that that's the thing that's going to make you remarkable. Now, it may be true that you can be remarkable because you are just consistently ahead of where you're going to where the consumer is going, and you build a process that you're just agile and responsive, and you're always a little bit ahead of the game. That could be an underlying engine for innovation. And if you look at, say, this is probably not the best example, but if you look at, say, fast fashion, right? They re-engineer their whole supply chain so that they are ahead of the trend with very attractive price points. That's built into their model, and it's not so easy for the traditional competitors to compete with that. So I think that seemingly small edge ends up being big when you do it consistently. But as it relates to the pandemic, I think the other thing maybe that's a little bit more of a strategy point, and I know we've touched on a few times, but with the lines of digital and physical blurring, we are seeing brands that were able to respond to the shift to online shopping, but in particular, the store fulfillment of digital orders, whether that's the curbside pickup or home delivery or ship from store. And if you've really built the foundation of that harmonized shopping and really have embraced the blur in a very fundamental way and made a lot of the technology investments and the cultural investments and all those kinds of things, I mean, that can give you real advantage. But it is becoming that seamless shopping experience, whatever you want to call it, that is becoming an expectation now. And so I think that was happening pre-pandemic, but certainly, like everything, I think we say every episode, it's been accelerated.
If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast platform, so you can catch up with all our great interviews, including Hal Lawton talking about Tractor Supply's remarkable Life Out Here growth story. New episodes of Season 5, presented by Market Dial, will show up each and every Tuesday. And be sure to tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
And I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at StephenPDennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker, and producer and host of a series of retail trade podcasts, including this one. You can learn even more about me on LinkedIn, and you can catch up with Steve and I in person at the NRF Big Show in New York, January 16th on the stage, talking about what it takes to be remarkable with Container Store SVP Gretchen Gantz. See you in New York, everyone.